In this lesson, we'll take a look at how the scientific thinking process can be applied to a question that is in the news lately about the origin of the virus that causes COVID-19. Now, what you see here is a picture of what many virologists think happened to cause the pandemic. That bats are host to many different kinds of viruses, coronaviruses, for example, and that perhaps some of these bat viruses got into some intermediate host species and from this animal into humans. It's also possible that the virus went directly from the bat to some humans, but we're going to call this the natural spillover hypothesis. That humans came into contact with animals that had this virus, and then humans started spreading this virus to each other. Now, in the context of COVID-19, the idea about this intermediate host species would be some of these animals that were found in wet markets in Wuhan, China. So that would have been the host species, that bat viruses got into these animals and humans were purchasing these animals in these wet markets, and then that provided an opportunity for the viruses to jump into humans. Now, this has happened before. There was a SARS epidemic and MERS epidemic that were thought to have arisen in this kind of way, from a host population to an intermediate host species to humans. The other idea is that the virus actually was being studied in a laboratory and then it escaped. So we'll call this the lab leak hypothesis. Now again, it would have been a bat virus, but that scientists were studying these bat viruses for various reasons we'll get into later. And that by accident, some of the viruses either infected some of the lab workers or somehow escaped the laboratory. And this too has happened before. So we have had examples of viruses that are normally being studied under very strict conditions that accidents happen. Humans are fallible and viruses have escaped, and other kinds of pathogens like deadly bacteria, for example. So in this lesson, let's apply our scientific thinking sort of format here to questions of the origin of the virus. So notice then, we're going to have two hypotheses, and we put the hypothesis next to the if. If natural spillover caused the pandemic, and if laboratory accident caused the pandemic. For the and, we're going to consider three aspects of the situation. The intermediate host, if there is one or not. Patient zero, who were the first people infected with this coronavirus, and then examining features of the genetic code of the virus. So let's take the first one. If natural spillover caused the pandemic and we examine the intermediate host species for the virus, we should discover virus in suspected host species. In other words, the prediction here is if it really did spill over, we should be able to detect the virus in these host species. If a laboratory accident caused the pandemic and we examine intermediate host species for the virus, then we will not find an intermediate host species because the virus moved from bats directly to humans. Now, that was because humans were collecting bat viruses and some got infected, or it was in the laboratory and the bat viruses infected the humans who were working in the lab. So there would be no intermediate host species. What about patient zero? If natural spillover caused the pandemic and we identify patient zero should be associated with the wet market. So this was the notion that animals, being the intermediate host, they would have been the ones in the wet market where humans were purchasing these animals, and that's where the initial infections would have happened. On the other hand, if laboratory accident caused the pandemic and we identify patient zero, then patient zero should be associated with the lab. What about genetic code? If natural spillover caused the pandemic and we examine the genetic code of the pandemic virus and compare it to its closest relatives in the wild, then we should detect a set of DNA mutations in the pandemic virus that could have happened through stepwise evolutionary change from its closest relatives in the wild. On the other hand, if laboratory accident caused the pandemic and we examine the genetic code of the pandemic virus and compare it to its closest relatives in the wild, then the pandemic virus should have genetic sequences not found in its closest relatives because they were selected for or inserted into the pandemic virus by humans in the lab. Now, if you've been following along, you might have caught a pattern here. These two hypotheses make different predictions. When we examine these features about the host or patient zero or the genetic code of the virus, the two hypotheses make different predictions, and that's a good state of affairs because that's going to help us decide between these hypotheses. Well, what are the results? So remember, we want to compare the results to the predictions to see if either of these hypotheses is supported or weakened. Well, at the time of this recording, this is late August 2021, the Chinese authorities have not found an intermediate host animal that has the virus. What about patient zero? Again, the early cases of the pandemic were associated with the wet market, but other reports from U.S. intelligence agencies say that there may have been some lab workers that were sick with COVID-like symptoms earlier than these wet market cases. So this is still uncertain here. The authorities in China have not released some of the information about the early patients in the pandemic. And what about the genetic code? Here again, virologists are debating the nature of the genetic code of the pandemic virus and whether it could have evolved naturally or whether there's evidence of human modification. So at this stage, we need more information. We can't sort of adjudicate, we can't decide the truth of one over the other at this stage because we just don't have enough evidence. But keep your eyes and ears open for this story in the news. The President Biden has issued, or he has tasked the intelligence agencies to do a report, and that report was recently released, and it was inconclusive. But perhaps in the near future, more information will come out, and we'll better be able to figure out whether this was a natural spillover event or a laboratory accident. But at this stage, we can't decide between those hypotheses. So to wrap up, I just wanted to say a word about why is it that scientists would be studying these viruses in the laboratory. Well, one controversial scientific technique is called gain-of-function research. And what virologists attempt to do here is they harvest viruses from the wild, so from bat populations, and then they want to study how these viruses evolve. And one way they study this is by getting a species, an animal species that can be infected by the virus. In fact, what scientists have done in the past is they genetically engineer a mouse, for example, so that its lung cells express a human protein. So these are mice that have been genetically changed so that they're a little bit more like humans. The lung tissue expresses a human protein, and that's the protein that the virus uses to get into those lung cells. So what they would do is they take the bat viruses and they would infect these genetically modified mice, and then they would look for the mice that are getting really sick and dying, and then they would collect those viruses and then pass them through another population of mice. And so they would infect mice and then select viruses that appeared to have more lethal features, or perhaps were more transmissible. So they want to study how these viruses can evolve to be more dangerous, more transmissible, or more deadly. And they do this by using populations of animals that sort of mimic human tissues, and then they just infect those animals and look for the ones that are getting sick and dying, and then they harvest the viruses from those animals, and then they do another round of infection. So they're kind of speeding up the evolution of the virus to become a more dangerous virus. This is called gain-of-function research as applied to viruses. Other techniques allow scientists to actually splice different parts of genetic codes from other viruses into the virus of interest. So the coronavirus has its own genetic material in the form of RNA. Well, scientists can take bits of RNA from other viruses and insert them into the genetic code of the virus to see what kinds of properties it gives the virus. Is it more infectious? Is it more lethal? Now you might be asking, well, why in the world are scientists doing this? Well, there are reasons to do this kind of research. What virologists will say that it's important to do this kind of research just to understand these viruses, how they operate. Also, by understanding how these viruses operate and how they might evolve, we might be able to predict which types of viruses in which animal populations in nature pose the greatest threat to humans. In addition, by studying viruses in this manner, new kinds of therapeutics might emerge. New ways of stopping viral infection and viral replication, like vaccines, for example, might be discovered. So the virologists are going to say there are benefits to this type of research. But of course, like so many things in life, there are risks in addition to the rewards of any kind of activity like this. We've seen here then the rewards of this kind of research would be just basic science understanding of the viruses, might be able to predict future pandemics, which viruses are going to be problems, might be able to come up with new drugs or vaccines and things to fight these viruses. But as we have seen, there is also a significant risk. If there was indeed a lab accident, then the risk was very large indeed. The risk would be a pandemic. So the very people studying the viruses in order to perhaps prevent a pandemic may have been instrumental in causing that pandemic. Now, this is still unknown at this point, but you can see then the risk versus reward. This is an ongoing debate among scientists, as well it should be in society at large. And that's one of the things I want to end with then. One of the important reasons to get a good education is that we have to be able to measure these risks and rewards and to balance them, make decisions about them. So in societies where people have the power, in democratic societies, citizens take on a social burden to understand technology as best they can, and then make judgments about which research projects should go forward. Self-governing societies must debate the risks and rewards of research that has the potential to affect humanity in profound ways. This obligation is another reason why getting a good education is very important. So we have discussed previously how a good education can equip you with new eyes. So some of us might look at a rock and just sort of not know much about a rock, but if we have a good education, we can connect rocks to the stars and supernova and to life on Earth. Of course, a good education can also give you practical knowledge and skills. In this case, what a good education can do is give you mental equipment for self-governance. We need to be able to make some difficult decisions, both to help our societies thrive, but also protect our societies from advancing technology.